For the last 2 years, you've been telling us that Australia is no longer a free country, that Canada is heading in the wrong direction, but one country, once the darling of the world's ultra high net worth set, is now in the crosshairs as well. I'm going to tell you why people say New Zealand is no longer free also. I've been telling people for years that there are other options that are closer, have better tax policies, have better passport policies, just better overall if you are an ultra high net worth individual than New Zealand is. And so here's an article from GB News. This is a website in the UK, and no doubt they have a little bit of a slant, but you can't argue with the truth. And they talk about how New Zealanders are quote unquote desperate to leave as thousands flee what they say is controlling and fearful Jacinda Ardern. The article is as follows. Borders were open to New Zealanders and Australians in February and March. Now visitors from around 60 visa waiver countries, including the UK, where this news source is, can enter the country if they are vaccinated and test negative for COVID-19 before and after arriving. Still one of the most aggressive regimes as the world has opened up, with countries like the UK requiring essentially nothing for anyone to go. But while tourists are starting to trickle into the country, Kiwis are fleeing the country en masse. Government officials have estimated 50,000 New Zealanders, no small number for such a small country, will flee the country over the next year as the borders reopen after 2 years of COVID-19 restricting travel. Speaking exclusively to GB News, the opposition, the ACT Party leader David Seymour, says Jacinda Ardern and her government's policies have resulted in New Zealand experiencing a level of despair not seen for years. He said, "Don't believe the hype. Anyone can quarantine a remote island. The hard part was always going to be reconnecting and getting their way of life back." At that, Jacinda Ardern's government has failed. Tragicomically, that's an interesting word. Her own rules mean she herself is now forced to isolate. Mr. Seymour says the government is going in the wrong direction and Kiwis are desperate to properly reconnect with the world. I will tell you, I was on the flight from Dubai to Kuala Lumpur, and then the flight continued from Kuala Lumpur to New Zealand. I said, okay, 7 hours, that's pleasant. Sitting on the ground for another hour and a half, and then another 10 and a half hours in the air. You're sitting there for 19 hours, 18 hours. Sorry, I went to a public school. Yeah, it's 19 hours. 10 and a half plus 1, 12, yeah, 19 hours. 19 hours? You're going, where are you going? It's worth going for 19 hours. He added, New Zealand faces a hangover from its COVID measures in the form of cost of living crisis, like many countries. What is different here is the despair that comes from being lectured to and restricted while the rest of the world moves on. Now, I'm not commenting on what David Seymour is saying, but look at the facts. We've shown you the facts. The world has reopened. For everyone who said, well, I want to get my second passport, but I want to go out there and check out the country first, and I don't feel comfortable traveling. The world is wide open right now, especially if you're vaccinated. And even if you're not vaccinated, plenty of countries are wide open. Australia, New Zealand, some of the most restrictive regimes. When I was getting on that flight, there was one place to stay in. Here's the perfect example, by the way, what we talk about soft freedom. Welcome to the flight. Oh, you're going to Malaysia? Stand over here. Just stand and wait. Oh, you're going to New Zealand? Stand over here. We're going to open your bag. We're going to dump it upside down. What is that, a water bottle? What's that? Oh, you can't have that. And then you get in the plane. Are you going, the people next to me? Oh, you're going to New Zealand? Oh, New Zealand? Okay. Yeah, you can't have that. Put that up. Don't let me see that. The difference between going to Malaysia, going to New Zealand, big difference. That's what I can only imagine David Seymour is talking about. And he's saying cost of living crisis, the world's moving on, their country is not. The government has blown a 25-point lead to trail the opposition just 18 months from the election, and the majority of New Zealanders say our country is going in the wrong direction for the first time since the global financial crisis. We're hearing the phrase brain drain for the first time in a decade. Hospitals report their nurses are leaving. It's dismal, and we could be doing so much better. Now, no doubt this guy is the opposition politician, but this mirrors what we have heard from folks from New Zealand. A popular Facebook group for New Zealanders living in Britain called Kiwis in London told GB News they've experienced a surge of interest from Kiwis desperate to make the move to Britain. Now imagine, listen, nothing wrong with the UK for many people, but imagine you're in a place where things are so restrictive that your thing is, where do they move to that country where they also have a lot of restrictions? But to their credit, the UK has widely opened up. I don't necessarily think that their tax policy is going the right direction, but if you're a foreigner, there might be some opportunities. This is not the number one place in the world to live, but it's a place where the people are comfortable, they speak the language. Imagine if we got these people to think of the nomad capitalist lifestyle, how much personal freedom, how much of a dent in their cost of living, how much of a dent in their tax bill they could put by going where they're treated best, not going to the UK, but going where they're treated best, not better, but best. And that's the problem with living in some of these countries, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand in recent years. Anything looks better, and then you're like, let me just make a marginal improvement. No, if you're going to move, you might as well move. Push the pedal to the metal. Don't move from California to Nevada. Don't move from California to Texas. Don't move from New Zealand to London. Push it all the way it can go. And so this is what they're talking about in New Zealand. They have escaped. Now, okay, we've picked fun at Jacinda every once in a while. She has run, let's call it a tight ship over the last couple of years. But people are now sick and tired, the politicians say, of the controlling narrative, the fear campaign, and the government messaging that has happened over the last 2 years. And I would argue even before the last 2 years. Now, Ms. Ardern has brushed off concerns that the high outflow of Kiwis leaving was a result of her government's strict rules. Well, whose fault would it be? Where does the buck stop, Jacinda? She said it was part of our history as a nation to have Kiwis regularly leave to go overseas and to come back with new skills. But this time they may not come back. Right? Most of the people on that plane were getting off in Malaysia. When I saw who was left, I'm kind of like looking down, looking, okay. It seemed like a pretty full plane getting off, right? And so, the Prime Minister is saying we've always had an inflow and outflow of New Zealanders. What if they don't come back? How many people, I can tell you from the folks that we work with, they're leaving. Some of them never want to come back. We have more people who are not Americans saying, what would be the process like if I gave up my citizenship? Now, most people do not leave, especially if they don't have any financial benefit, and give up their citizenship right away. But they are getting second passports more readily. New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, people who a couple years ago said, I'm not an American, I don't have this global tax. Now they're saying, you know what? Talk of New Zealand of a wealth tax. That did subside for a while, but it was kind of made clear it could come back at some point. There is talk of rising taxes. There is the same kind of anti-wealth sentiment going on in New Zealand as there is in much of the West, where people need to pay more just because they have more, as if it's somehow your fault there was a pandemic and your business did well because it was online. That's your fault and you're evil and you needed to pay. That's the mindset in New Zealand. And obviously, on top of that, you're sitting in a market like New Zealand where domestically you have such a small market to sell to. From a time zone level, it's complicated doing business with the rest of the world. I mean, there's so many reasons why you want to be there in the first place. And the Senate is like, well, it couldn't be our restrictive policies. I mean, the country, they're not even going to let people buy cigarettes anymore. I don't smoke. Maybe you don't smoke. This country's it's fallen off the edge. And so, I look at a country like Ireland. You could see the same thing. Always had an inflow and outflow. Do you know how happy they were back during the Celtic Tiger when everyone was coming back? They've been working on bringing people back. And look, they've built a strategy that was promoted on low corporate tax rates, not necessarily bringing in tax revenue from corporations, from the evil rich, but by having those people create jobs, raising wages, people paying taxes. Now you've got a housing shortage in the country. Wages are one of the highest in the world. That model worked. New Zealand obviously is doing something that's wrong. People are leaving and they may not come back. And so people are even calling it the hermit kingdom to describe the country's lockout of their own citizens, visa holders, and tourists over the last 2 years. We talked about Australia doing that. New Zealand, in some cases, wasn't really that much better, keeping out people who have the right to come in an effort to close the whole place down. You can say whatever you want about that policy, and people certainly, including this audience, will sometimes defend it. But if you're a citizen of the country, if you're a resident of a country, you had a deal with that country, a deal that was solidified probably by years of your paying very high amounts of taxes to that country, only to then leave for a while and then want to come back during a pandemic, and they wouldn't let you in some cases. That's not a free country. The policies on the freedom level are heading in the wrong direction. The policies in the tax department look like they're heading in the wrong direction. People are leaving. 50,000. This is not the United States. New Zealand is a small country. 50,000 people is a lot. We have helped a number of New Zealanders who are either moving or who want to be ready to move. And so what we're seeing is an expansion of it. It used to be just Americans. It used to be just certain people from certain countries in certain parts of the world. It is now expanding, and these people are preparing themselves. They're putting their money into insurance policies for citizenship. They're moving their families. This is exactly a direct result of the restrictive policies of New Zealand, and I think it will continue until somebody down there realizes that they're doing it the wrong way.